Hey, it's Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to pick up with Unit 11, the Cold War era. We're going to be talking about that period immediately after World War II, where the United States of America and the Soviet Union emerge, of course, as enemies. We'll start today by going to lesson number 1. It says the plan for the post-war world. In other words, after the war was over with, what was the plan? Now, we do know that the three major countries that were the victors, of course, in WWII were the United States, Great Britain, Soviet Union, and then France to a lesser degree. But you have to understand that France was defeated early on in the war, but they're going to be given an equal opportunity to have their say in terms of what should happen in the post-war world, and specifically what should happen with Germany. Today, what we're going to do is look at our unit focus question, of course, for the entire unit. We won't answer that question. We will at some point come back and address it at the end of the unit. The questions for unit focus is what effect did the Cold War have on the United States and its relationship with the other nations around the world? And 2, describe American prosperity during the post-World War period. World War II period. Now, once again, we won't answer those questions today, but we will answer those questions at some point when we finish this particular unit. We'll start with the vocabulary, and as we always do, we give you the content and the academic vocabulary. And as we tell you, you should keep a journal, go through and write down the definitions of these words, of course, on your own. And as we see them, as they come up in the PowerPoint, we will give you a brief explanation of what that term would be. The lesson focus question, unlike the unit focus question, we will answer. And we have 2 lesson focus questions for this particular lesson. Number 1, how did the United States and other allies try to stabilize European and Asian economies to prevent another depression and war after WWII? And number 2, how did American and Soviet interests clash in the future of the post-war Europe? All right, but before we get started with all that, let's talk about have a few minutes and go over a do now activity. And in getting ready for this lesson, we would like you to keep this particular journal topic in mind. It says, take a moment to think about the term Cold War and what does it make you think of. We'll give you a couple of moments to write down your response, and we'll be back on the other side in just a minute. Okay, you should have had enough time that you were able to go through, of course, and look at that term Cold War and what does it mean or what does it make you think of? Well, when you think of a war, you think of course, adversaries. Think about, of course, people fighting. And that would be what we would call a hot war, where you actually have 2 enemies and their militaries are engaging and death, of course, occurs. When we're looking at a Cold War, it's a little bit different. A Cold War is a war of tensions. It is, and in this particular case, we're talking about the tension that arises between the United States of America and the Soviet Union following WWII. And we're going to find that Cold War, of course, where the United States of America and the Soviet Union never really fight, but we do have situations where their interests and our interests clash, and we find ourselves on opposite sides supporting different groups as they conduct war. So what we'll do, of course, is keep that in mind, of course, when we're thinking about Cold War as we proceed. All right, we'll start with the birth of internationalism. Now, you have to remember, before World War II and before World War I, the United States of America was an isolationist country, meaning very simply, we didn't think we should get involved in the affairs of other nations around the world. We're going to find that after World War II that changes because we recognize that we have a responsibility to the rest of the world as being one of the great nations in the world to make sure that we do our part, of course, to keep the peace. The goal of FDR and Truman was to prevent another war by addressing some of the issues that caused World War II. The Bretton Woods system would address economic issues that caused the Depression by creating the World Bank, which would give bank loans to developing nations, and the International Monetary Fund was created to help nations with trade deficits by keeping tariffs low, both of which still exist today. The American dollar was set as the world's reserve currency, and it would be based on the gold standard. At that particular time, you had $35, you can go and buy 1 ounce of gold. I wish I could buy it for $35 today. I think the Gordon rate is a little over $2,000 an ounce today. The United Nations will be created with the Allied nations as the permanent members of the Security Council, and its purpose would be to preserve the peace. Now, you remember now, after World War I, the League of Nations was proposed in the United States of America to get involved. And that's one of the failures of the United States of America's responsibility to prevent future wars from happening. And because of that, a few years later, after World War I, we'll be fighting World War II. At least that's what a lot of historians and a lot of people would tell you. Here you have a picture of the United Nations flag. If you go to New York City, you can see this symbol, of course, on the UN building. Here we're going to talk about two conferences. The first conference we're going to talk about is right before the end of WW2 and right before actually the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's in the middle of these two other world leaders. At the Yalta Conference, it was the meeting of Churchill, FDR, Stalin, and it was about discussing the plans for a liberated Europe built on self-determination or self-governance and plans for Germany post-World War II. In other words, what do we do with Germany once the war is over with? And what do we do about all these nations that are going to be liberated from German control? Do we give them an opportunity, of course, to create their own government? And that's what's agreed upon. Now, one of the things that comes out of the Yalta Conference, of course, would be a divided Germany. At the Yalta Conference, the decision was made to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones, and the capital city of Berlin would also be divided. The zones would be managed by the big 4 allies with a French zone, a British zone, an American zone, and a Soviet zone. Dividing Berlin would mean that the non-communist zones in Berlin would be isolated in the communist Soviet zone. What I simply mean by that is this here. When you look at the division of Germany, we're going to show you, of course, exactly what we're trying to explain to you right now, is that Berlin, the capital city of Germany, is going to be located within the Soviet zone. And the Soviet zone is a communist zone. But we're going to find that because Berlin is divided into 4 occupation zones just like Germany is, part of the democratic part of Berlin is going to be within the confines of Soviet communist-controlled East Germany. And we'll get to that in a minute, and we'll show you what we mean. We can show you better than we can tell you in this particular case. The American, French, and British zones would be united to create a democratic West Germany a little bit later, and the Soviet zone would be a communist East Germany, and Berlin would become East Berlin, which would be communist, and then West Berlin which would become democratic. All right, we were telling you a few seconds ago, we're going to give you a picture of what it looks like when we're talking about Berlin, of course, being democratic West Berlin being inside of communist East Germany. Well, all this that you see in gray here is the Soviet zone. And that Soviet zone, of course, was East Germany, or will become East Germany. And you'll notice that inside of it, you see the capital city of Berlin. Well, just like we split Germany up into 4 occupation zones, we split Berlin up into 4 occupation zones also. But the only problem is not a problem for East Berlin, because East Berlin, of course, is communist. But if you look at West Berlin, which is comprised of a British zone, a French zone, and an American zone, it is democratic, and it's located within a communist East Germany. And that's going to lead to some problems. All right. The next conference happens after the death of FDR, and our new president of the United States of America is Harry S. Truman. And at this particular conference, we're going to have the new British Prime Minister. In this particular case, his name is Clement Attlee. He replaces Winston Churchill. In the middle, you have Harry S. Truman, President of the United States of America. And on the right, you have Joseph Stalin. The only one, of course, that is still around at the Potsdam Conference, which is just a short time after the Yalta Conference, is going to be Joseph Stalin. All right, now, what was the purpose of the Potsdam Conference? It was held to firm plans for post-war Germany, which would include minimal reparations and the confirmation of the new German-Polish border created by the Soviets. One of the things that Truman was adamant about was that the fact that Germany should not have to pay these high reparations. He, in his mind, that because Germany had to pay these high reparations, of course, in after World War I, it's one of the things, of course, that leads to, in his mind, the difficulties that Europe faces, in that post-war period. And he also thinks that it contributes, of course, to the worldwide depression that we have a little bit later. So, in his mind, Germany should be punished, but they shouldn't have to pay a whole lot of reparations. And that's what the Soviets wanted, because they needed somebody, of course, to pay for this war. But they did settle, or Stalin did settle for, the establishment of a Polish-German border that would favor the Soviet Union as kind of a buffer between Western Europe and the Soviet Union, so that the Soviet Union wouldn't be subject to another European, invasion from a Western European nation. Iron Curtain. The term Iron Curtain was coined by Winston Churchill at a speech in Fulton, Missouri on May 5th, 1946. The term Iron Curtain described a divide between Eastern European satellite nations of the Soviet Union and the rest of Western Europe. Stalin was able to secure communist nations as a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the rest of Western Europe. Here's a picture of what that Iron Curtain looks like. And if you look at everything over here in blue, this would be our NATO allies. And we'll talk about NATO in a few minutes. And then on the other side of here, we have the communist Soviet Union. And you'll notice all these little countries down here, of course, that are in pink, like the Soviet Union. They're going to be communist nations, and that would be called Communist Eastern Europe. All these countries over here are free democratic Western Europe, and that's what Churchill was talking about when he made that speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. He was saying that this curtain had descended that separated the East from the West, the free from the communists. After looking at that brief history, of course, of the Iron Curtain, what we want to do now is transition into doing an activity. At this time, we will pause the presentation and allow you time to copy the activity on the United Nations. Once you have completed the activity, you should turn it into your teacher to be graded. Good luck, and we will see you in a bit to review your answers. At this time, go ahead and start your copying. You should have had enough time that you were able to go through, of course, and copy and complete the activity that we gave you on the United Nations. Here we have an answer key on the United Nations, and what we're going to do is give you a few brief answers. And at any time, when you want to, you can go back and access the key, which is included in the presentation to get more specific answers. But briefly, what we want to do is go over a few things. And the first thing is we want to look at number 2, the founding principles. It says, list and explain 3 founding principles of the United Nations. Sovereignty for all member states. All nations, regardless of size, power, have equal rights and responsibilities within the United Nations. Peaceful settlement of disputes. The United Nations encourages countries to resolve their conflicts through dialogue and negotiation rather than force, and the promotion of human rights. The UN aims to uphold and promote fundamental human rights for all people, regardless of nationality, race, and religion. And then we look at the structure of the United Nations. And once again, all these things you could have included in the worksheet, of course, that you were given. And looking at the overall structure, we have the General Assembly, the Security Council, which has 5 permanent members, the International Court of Justice, the Secretariat, the Economic and Social Council, and the Trusteeship Council. And once again, at some point you can go through, of course, after having turned it into your teacher, go back and refer to this answer key and get any questions answered that you would have, of course, about the United Nations. All right, that's the end of the activity. We hope you did well, and once again, you can access the activity and the key in the reference slide in the video description. All right, what we're going to do real quickly is look at the lesson focus questions for lesson 1. This is, how did the United States and other allies try to stabilize European and Asian economies to prevent another depression and war after World War II? And then, how did American and Soviet interests clash in the future of the post-war Europe? Well, let's look at that for a second in terms of looking at what your answers could have been. How did the United States and other allies try to stabilize European and Asian economies to prevent another depression and war after World War II? By creating plans for Europe at the Bretton Woods Conference, at the Yalta Conference, and the Potsdam Conference. The 3 conferences would address issues regarding self-determination for nations. It would create the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and divide Germany into 4 occupation zones. And looking at the second question, how did American and Soviet interests clash in the future of the post-war Europe? The Soviets were interested in only promoting their self-interest. They wanted a communist buffer zone in Eastern Europe to protect themselves, and heavy reparations against Germany, and the U.S. was interested in preventing future wars and giving self-determination for those nations of Europe. In other words, the United States of America favored keeping communism in its existing borders and making sure that the nations of Western Europe had the opportunity to choose what type of government they would have, whether it would be a free democratic government or it would be a communist government, but it would be a decision that would be made by individual nations. All right, that is the end, of course, of the Cold War, the plan for the post-war world. We hope you got some insights in terms of what the Cold War was about and what the United States of America's role in it was. Remember what I always tell you, though. Now, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Don't take my word for it. Do your research, come up with your own conclusions, and we'll see you next time.